December 1943, North Africa. A makeshift stage in the desert. American soldiers, men who had been living in foxholes and eating cold rations and watching their friends die for the better part of a year, sat in the dirt in their uniforms and stared at a small man in civilian clothes standing in front of a microphone. He had no band, no elaborate staging, no Hollywood production values, just a voice and a microphone, and the particular kind of silence that descends when a room full of exhausted men realizes that something real is about to happen. Frank Sinatra opened his mouth and sang. The men in the front rows, soldiers, combat veterans, men who had not shown softness in months because softness in a war zone was a luxury they could not afford, began to cry, not quietly, not with embarrassment. They cried the way men cry when they have been holding something for too long, and someone finally says the exact right thing in the exact right way, and the walls come down all at once. Back home in America, at that exact moment, those same men's wives and mothers and sisters were burning Frank Sinatra's records in the street because Frank Sinatra was not in uniform. And in 1943, in a country at total war, that was the one thing America could not forgive. This is episode 2, the draft, the accusation, the hatred of an entire country directed at one man. And the way Frank Sinatra responded, not with apology, not with surrender, but with the only weapon he had ever owned, his voice, pointed directly at the people who needed it most. January 1943. The United States has been at war for 13 months. Every able-bodied young American man is either in uniform working in a defense plant or explaining himself. The social contract of wartime America is absolute and unforgiving. You serve or you are less than a man. There is no middle ground. There is no nuance. There is no acceptable alternative. Frank Sinatra received his draft classification in the fall of 1942. The verdict from the Selective Service was 4F, medically unfit for military service. The reason, a perforated eardrum, a condition present since birth, a consequence of the forceps delivery that had scarred his face and neck 18 months before. The condition was real. The documentation was legitimate. The military had examined him and determined he could not serve. America did not believe it. The narrative formed within weeks and spread with the velocity of something that people wanted to be true. Frank Sinatra, young, healthy, vigorous, the most famous entertainer in the country, was hiding behind a convenient medical deferment while real men shipped out to die on Pacific beaches and North African deserts. The Bobby Soxers who had screamed his name at the Paramount were the sisters and girlfriends and wives of those men. Their loyalty to a civilian entertainer in this context began to look like a betrayal of something more important. The press led the charge. Westbrook Pegler, one of the most widely read newspaper columnists in America, a man with a talent for sustained public contempt, made Sinatra a recurring target. Lee Mortimer of the New York Daily Mirror joined in. The accusations were not subtle. They called him a draft dodger, a coward, a man who used his fame and his money and his connections to avoid the sacrifice that ordinary Americans were making every day. Veterans organizations held public meetings to condemn him. Radio stations in certain markets refused to play his records. The fan clubs that had organized themselves with such passionate efficiency in the Paramount years began to dissolve. Women who had fainted at the sight of him 2 years earlier now held organized demonstrations outside theaters where he was scheduled to perform. They burned his records in the street. Frank Sinatra watched it happen and did not bow his head. He could not carry a rifle. He carried a microphone instead, and he took it to places that rifles had already been. The instinct of a lesser man in Sinatra's position would have been to go quiet, to wait it out, to keep a low profile and let the war end and hope that time eroded the hostility. Many people around him advised exactly this approach. His managers, his publicists, the studio executives who were trying to protect their investment in him. Frank Sinatra did the opposite. He went to the troops. The USO, the United Service Organizations, which coordinated entertainment for American military personnel, sent performers to bases and staging areas across the country and eventually overseas. The most dangerous overseas assignments were in the active theaters of war, North Africa, Italy, the Pacific, where the front lines were close enough to hear, and the men who needed entertainment most were also the men most difficult and most dangerous to reach. Many performers chose the safer assignments: military bases in England, staging areas in the continental United States, appearances that allowed them to serve the cause without placing themselves in direct proximity to the conflict. Sinatra chose North Africa and Italy. In the fall and winter of 1943, he traveled to the front lines of the Mediterranean theater, to places where the ground was still churned from recent artillery, where the men in the audience had been in combat within the past week, where the smell of war was not metaphorical, but physical and present. He performed on stages that were sometimes nothing more than wooden pallets laid across the mud. He performed with minimal equipment, and sometimes just a guitar player, sometimes just a piano, sometimes just his voice in the open air, with no amplification at all. The logistics were grueling. The travel was punishing. The conditions were nothing like the carefully staged productions of his American career. He did not complain about any of it. He showed up night after night in places that civilian entertainers had no particular obligation to visit, and he sang to men who had not heard anything beautiful in a very long time. What happened at those performances was described in remarkably consistent terms by the soldiers who witnessed them. The men arrived exhausted, many of them hostile. Some had been told by family members back home about the record burnings, the accusations, the controversy, and they arrived at the shows with the predetermined judgment that this man had something to answer for. And then he sang. The hostility dissolved in the first two songs. By the third song, men who had not permitted themselves to feel anything soft in months were experiencing something they could not explain and would not have predicted. Sinatra sang directly to the loneliness, to the specific, precise loneliness of a man far from home who did not know if he was coming back, who carried the faces of his wife and his children and his mother in his chest like a weight that never lifted. He sang the songs those men could not say out loud. He said them instead from a wooden pallet in the North African desert in a voice that carried across the military silence like something sent specifically for them. Veterans who attended those performances spoke about them for the rest of their lives. Not about the celebrity, about the experience, about what it meant in that context to hear someone sing that honestly about the things that mattered most. He gave everything he had to the men in uniform. The men's families back home still wanted to destroy him. The USO performances did not resolve the controversy at home. The press continued its campaign. The accusations continued. The record burnings continued. There was a quality to the hatred that was impervious to evidence. The narrative of Frank Sinatra as draft dodger had taken on a life of its own, had become a thing that people needed to believe regardless of what he actually did. He fought back publicly in ways that his advisors begged him not to. He gave press conferences where he presented his medical documentation and challenged any journalist to disprove it. He wrote columns. He gave radio interviews. He did not adopt the posture of a man seeking forgiveness or trying to demonstrate sufficient humility to earn the public's pardon. He adopted the posture of a man who had been wrongly accused and was not going to pretend otherwise, and this made the press hate him more. The American media of 1943 was not accustomed to targets who fought back directly. Public figures who were under attack were expected to go quiet, to demonstrate contrition, to perform enough self-abasement that the public could feel its judgment had been respected. Sinatra refused every element of this performance. He was not sorry. He had done nothing to be sorry for. A medical condition he had carried since birth had disqualified him from military service. He had taken the alternative available to him, going to the combat zones anyway, performing for the men who were fighting, singing the songs they needed to hear in the places where they needed to hear them. He had done this voluntarily, at personal discomfort and genuine risk, without asking for credit. He was not going to apologize for it. The stubbornness infuriated his enemies and quietly impressed a significant portion of the public that watched the exchange. There was something in Sinatra's refusal to perform contrition, something recognizably American in its directness and its pride that resonated with people who had their own experience of being wrongly judged and expected to apologize for it anyway. His record sales did not collapse. His concert bookings continued. The machine of his fame absorbed the hostility and kept running, powered by the essential fact that when Frank Sinatra sang, people still stopped whatever they were doing and listened. He could have kept his head down and waited for the war to end. Instead, he used his voice for the most dangerous cause in America. 1945. The war in Europe is ending. American soldiers are coming home. The country is preparing to celebrate victory, to absorb its returning heroes, to return to something resembling normalcy after 4 years of total sacrifice. And in the American South, black veterans who had fought for their country in segregated units, who had risked their lives under the same flag as their white counterparts, were coming home to a country that still denied them basic human dignity. They were beaten for sitting in the wrong section of a bus. They were refused service at lunch counters. Some were lynched, murdered by mobs in the same communities they had returned to as decorated veterans. Frank Sinatra was paying attention. The position of racial equality was not, in 1945, a comfortable or politically safe position for an American entertainer to take. The entertainment industry was largely segregated. Venues across the country, hotels, theaters, nightclubs, maintained explicit policies of racial exclusion. The path of least resistance for a performer who wanted to protect his career was to accept these arrangements as facts of the industry and proceed accordingly. Sinatra refused. He began refusing to perform in any venue that excluded black audiences from attending. This was not a quiet, private policy. He made it explicit and public. He would not play venues that practiced racial segregation, period, regardless of what it cost him in bookings or commercial relationships. In the entertainment industry of 1945, this cost him considerably. He walked off stages. He canceled engagements. He turned down money that represented significant portions of his annual income. He did it consistently without making speeches about it as a matter of straightforward principle. If you could not allow every American who wanted to hear him sing to come through your doors, he was not interested in your doors. He went further. He filmed a short subject called The House I Live In, a 10-minute piece built around a simple argument for racial and religious tolerance, framed as a conversation between Sinatra and a group of boys who were about to beat up a Jewish kid in an alley. The film was explicit in its message and unambiguous in its politics. This was not a Hollywood actor tiptoeing around a sensitive issue. This was a man saying directly and publicly what he believed. The House I Live In won an honorary Academy Award in 1946, a special Oscar presented to Sinatra for his contribution to tolerance and understanding. He donated his entire fee from the film to charity. He was 30 years old. He had been called a coward and a draft dodger for 3 years. He had just won an Oscar for courage. While America argued about whether to love him or hate him, Frank Sinatra became the biggest star in the world. And inside the house in Hasbrouck Heights, something was breaking. The paradox of the war years was that the controversy surrounding Sinatra's draft status did nothing to slow the commercial momentum of his career. It may even have accelerated it. The intensity of public argument about Frank Sinatra, whether positive or negative, kept his name in front of audiences who could not stop thinking about him regardless of which side they were on. By 1945, he was appearing in films for RKO and MGM Anchors Away with Gene Kelly, a naval musical that allowed him to play a sailor on shore leave, a casting choice that his detractors noted with considerable irony. The film was a massive hit. He was nominated for an Academy Award. He had a radio show. He had record deals. He had a film career. He had more work than he could comfortably manage and more money than a kid from Hoboken had any realistic expectation of accumulating in a lifetime. He also had a wife and 3 children in a house in Hasbrouck Heights, New Jersey, who were seeing less and less of him as the career demanded more and more. Nancy Sinatra, his first wife, the woman from the Hoboken neighborhood who had believed in him when nobody else had, who had worked as a secretary to support them both during the Roadhouse years, who had been there for everything before the fame arrived, was watching her husband become someone she recognized less clearly with each passing month. The Frank Sinatra who had come to her as a young man with nothing had been replaced by a man with everything, and the particular restlessness of someone who has achieved what he said he wanted and found, upon arrival, that it is not enough. The fame was real. The success was real. The hunger that had driven all of it was still real. And the hunger, now that the professional obstacles had been largely cleared, was looking for something else to feed on. Her name was Ava Gardner. He had met her briefly in 1943. There was a passing introduction at a gathering where she was already a face that stopped conversations. By 1946, they were encountering each other with increasing frequency in the overlapping social world of Hollywood. And the thing that would come to define the next decade of his life was beginning to take its specific, terrible, inevitable shape. He had won every public battle. The private ones were just beginning. By the end of 1946, Frank Sinatra had emerged from the war years with his career intact and his reputation for fearlessness established. He had gone to the combat zones when he didn't have to. He had fought back against a sustained media campaign without apologizing. He had used his position to advocate for racial equality when it cost him real money and real opportunities. He had won an Oscar for his principles. The men who had called him a coward were quiet now. The record burnings had stopped. The veterans who had attended his USO performances in North Africa and Italy had come home and told their families what they had seen. A small man in civilian clothes standing on a wooden stage in the mud and singing his heart out for men who needed it. And those stories had spread with the particular authority of first-hand accounts from people whose service could not be questioned. He had fought the war he was allowed to fight. He had fought it with everything he had. But the man who came home from those years was carrying something that the public performances and the Oscar acceptance and the sold-out concerts did not reveal. The accusations had not broken him. Nothing could break Frank Sinatra in public, but they had deposited something in him. A knowledge of how quickly the crowd that worships you can become the crowd that hates you. A suspicion of consensus. A deepened loyalty to the people who had stood by him during the burning years and a deepened contempt for the people who had not. He had also absorbed in those years of being the most debated man in America a clarity about his own nature. He was not a man built for compromise or patience or the careful management of other people's perceptions. He was going to live the way he was going to live, say what he was going to say, love who he was going to love, and absorb the consequences of all of it without pretending any of it was different from what it was. That clarity was his greatest strength and the source of everything that was about to destroy him. The war ended. America celebrated. The soldiers came home. Frank Sinatra had survived the war years with his career intact and his principles uncompromised. He had done it the hard way, the only way he knew. Standing in the open, fighting back, refusing to bend. But something was coming that he could not fight his way through. He could withstand a hostile press. He could withstand record burnings and veterans groups and newspaper campaigns. He could withstand the hatred of people who had decided he was something he was not. He could not withstand Ava Gardner, because Ava Gardner was not an enemy. She was something far more dangerous. She was the first person he had ever met who was exactly as alive as he was, as fierce, as restless, as incapable of being contained by the ordinary arrangements of an ordinary life. She would give him the greatest love of his life. She would take everything else. Next episode, the affair, the scandal, the destroyed marriage, the voice that begins to fail, and a Frank Sinatra standing at 38 years old with nothing left, no career, no record deal, no wife, no voice, facing the question of whether a man can build himself twice from nothing. The answer will surprise everyone who was certain they already knew it.